Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the CPI Generic Web Service and N3G NCIC XML Birds of a Feather session. I am Lori Ambrose, Director of Project Management at CPI. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to take a moment to review some housekeeping items. As a reminder, this session is being recorded. All microphones are live to facilitate open discussion when we pause for Q&A. I would ask that during the presentation, and if you are not speaking, to please mute your microphone to cut down on background noise. You can do this by clicking on the microphone icon in the app. Sometimes during virtual meetings, it is easy to talk over each other. I urge all of you to take a moment before speaking to make sure the current speaker has completed their thought or comment. We want to be respectful while allowing everyone to be heard. If you do not have an integrated microphone on your computer, you can also dial in from your phone or use the chat function to pose questions. If you use the chat function, please limit your posts to one question at a time so we can keep up. If we run out of time or are unable to fully answer any questions, we will be sending up a follow-up with additional information. At this time, I'd like to introduce Ian Warner, Director of Communications, who will give an update on two CPI R&D initiatives, Generic Web Services and N3G NCIC XML. Ian Warner.
Thank you, Laurie. Hi, guys. Can't see you, but I know you're out there. I think we've got over 30 people here, so hopefully you guys can get something out of this, and hopefully we can have a nice discussion. And as Laurie said, this is an open discussion, so you can either put in some questions on the chat or just wait for a break here and chime in with anything that you want to talk about. So with that said, let's just get into this. The topic is web services, so we bundled two of these together. And I'd like to start by taking you back to last year's TIM, where we had a discussion on general switch communications, and myself and Steve gave a presentation. We talked about how the CPI switch is able to add value, and we talked about how we reuse interfaces and the general CPI philosophy. So I'd like to start with a slide from that 2019 TIM. It's the CPI philosophy slide, verbatim from 2019. And what we talk about here is our philosophy in order to maximize reuse and leverage existing work. The way we want to do that always in the switch is to implement and enforce standards. And whenever we can do that, it just makes our life easier, and more importantly, your life, because what we're trying to do is reuse what we've got over and over so that new endpoints, as it says here in bullet 2, can be configurable instead of programmable. We just want to stay, that's a basic tenet of the switch, is make everything as configurable as possible so that we don't have to go in and hard code anything. So as this slide says, we want to implement and enforce standards. And to do that, we have to produce protocol specs and messaging specs. We've done that, as you're all familiar with, Foxtalk or DMPP 2020 interfaces, where you have remote agencies connect into you. And you can imagine if you couldn't just go in and configure those, that every time you had a new agency, you had to get involved in a lengthy back and forth, agree on a specification of this. So once you have a protocol and a messaging spec, that frees you up to gain control over your message switch and dictate how people talk to you. It's not always possible, especially in the web services world, and that's what we want to cover next. But we've done it in Foxtalk, we've done it in DMPP 2020, those Remo type interfaces, REM serves. There's some in various states that use their own state version of that, but essentially, you can configure a new agency and get them up and running pretty quickly. So on that basis, the two most popular interfaces that people talk to us about today in the RFP process and in the SOW process are web services. So the industry has kind of swung completely to web services. now. They're not really training anybody to come out and code socket type interfaces. In my second presentation on the NCIC 3G update, even they've recognized this, and they realize that the web services is basically taken over. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the modern world and web services before we move into the piece that we've taken with that. So on this slide, you see the two different types of web services that come up. There are more types, but these are the two predominant types. You've got the legacy SOAP web services. This goes back probably 30 years now, and these are the heavy weight web services. There's a lot of built-in support for web services standards that you can put in the headers. And for the past 30 years or so, the SOAP web services has been the way to go. But as the world progressed, they wanted a lighter weight version of that, and they came up with RESTful. Both of these use HTTP protocol over TCP/IP sockets in the background, but they abstract the details of how you have to program sockets. And that's why people like them. They like to bring up their IDEs and generate stubs and ties and various artifacts that will do a lot of the heavy lifting. And so, if we give out a DMPP 2020 or a Foxtalk spec anymore, people just kind of shake their head and go, yeah, but we're going to take 6 months to learn this. Don't you guys have web services? Well, of course we've had web services for a long time, but it's tended to be a custom. And again, the SOW process, we're reacting in that process at the point. So we've done that. We literally have hundreds and hundreds of web services out there. But especially at last year's TIM, we received feedback that it would be nice if we could have something similar to the way that we control the Remo interfaces in the past. You guys don't want to lose that. So what we've done on that side of things is come up with what we're calling for now generic web services. Might end up getting renamed WS Remo at the very end. But right now, just want to move on and talk a little bit about the different models that we're trying to cover. So in any web service, whether it's REST or SOAP, you want to cover these two basic models, sync and async. And the sync model is where we're at the moment. We have the client side of that done. We're working on a proof of concept for the server side. That's pretty close to being done. And then later in the year, we'll work on, or next year, we'll work on the async model. I just want to describe the various models just so everyone knows what we're talking about here. And so in a synchronous model, and we'll talk from the switch perspective. If I'm the switch and I want to make a call to a remote repo, and we get these requests all the time, we'll get, can you install a web service that will talk to the latest and greatest repository? And the one that's popped up more often than not recently is the medical marijuana repository. So as various states roll out a law for medical marijuana, they need to be able to check that you're actually licensed to have that. And so they have medical marijuana registries. There's other ones listed here, like the CCLs, the concealed carry registry, sex offender registries. So as they come on, you want to be able to query them from the switch. You've got an existing message queue, and you want to leverage that, make a spawned query to these various registries. So typically the way that works today is you go off to those people and say, you need to be able to do this. You come together, and they provide us a custom specification, and not one of them are the same. They'll put up a WSDL or some service that's it's got a lot of their custom XML in it. There's a lot of custom procedures. There's a lot of jumping through hoops that doesn't really need to be open in the COM world. The COM should be just a very simple exercise of getting and receiving messages, but a lot of people put a hell of a lot up front. I've had a WSDL sent to me that had over 200 operations, and all I wanted to do was query a database, just one simple operation. But everything's bundled into one, and it makes our life very difficult. It makes everything custom. So what we're trying to do here is basically get to the point of where we can. There we go, indeed. we want to get to a point where we're handing out those two documents, where we're taking back control of the interfaces. So in order to do that, we can only justify that if we can reuse standards and produce a document that everyone's happy with on the other end. So what we've done with generic web services is basically say, all right, if you'll publish our contract and then agree to exchange messages that we both understand, then we can move forward on a configurable basis on the message switch. So the sync client, and a good example of this is a DMV client or a DL photo client. We want to get to a point where if you can give these documents to the remote vendor and say, please implement this contract, then once they've done that and they provide you a URL, all you have to do on the switch is bring up a class GWS station, configure a class GWS station, and configure some parameters that will allow you to talk to that contract. Now, again, because CPI came up with the contract, and all you're doing is changing a URL, we can inherently know how to talk to that. So that's the communication part complete. Then there's a security part to it as well. And we'll make that configurable as well. We allow you to configure an OAuth or a basic authentication, or even put credentials in the SOAP header. And there'll probably be some of those as we add as we go along. We've covered the most common at the moment. And then the other part of the sync model here, we've covered client, which we have done a proof of concept for, and that's actually a working model. The server side of synchronous is in reverse. So again, synchronous means that you get an immediate response, not an acknowledgement, not a receipt. You get the actual application response. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about sync versus async. Now on the server side, you can still have a sync model if the switch acts as a synchronous server. So think about an agency who just wants to use our roles and authentication to verify for their own application that someone is authorized to run certain message keys. They can send an authorization message to us, an RAuth message key or an auth message key. Give us the details of the person, and we will look them up in the CPI database and provide a synchronous immediate response, true or false, or details on what this person's allowed to query. And then you also can get that. Another very typical example is a DMV. They don't want to put an async model in place where they have to wait for a callback. They have basically someone at titling who's standing there. Their job is to title a vehicle, but they don't do that if parts are stolen or the vehicle stolen itself. So they like to run an NCIC check, an immediate check. And so they want a synchronous response. They don't want a receipt, an acknowledgement, and get back to me later, and then they have to implement another receiver on the other side. So this is a valuable little piece too, and we've pretty much covered this. Just trying to get this the server side wrapped up by the end of the year. The async model, as you well know, is a good example of that would be the endless model, where you send a query, they give you a receipt, and then the session closes. Then in the background, they forward that registration query or whatever to another state. That state eventually responds, and we get a callback. And that would be the async model. That's a lot more difficult. There's a lot of challenges on that we have to cover before we can do that. Not least of which is the persistent versus non-persistent connection issue. So if we were to implement this model, we have to come up with a way for us to be able to troubleshoot it a little better. Because right now, you have, with the DMPP 2020 model and the Foxtalk model, you have a persistent connection. And that's great because HA is able to alert you or SAM on site that the connection is dropped. In the web services model, the async model that we're talking about here, you don't know whether the connection's up or down. So there are certain interfaces where that might be crucial to know. Instead of right at the moment of delivering a message, you find out it's down. So we need to come up with a way to mitigate that. So moving on. This is kind of a little small. I have a couple of blown up screens coming next, but this is the basic configurator station configuration screen. I don't know if you can see that, but it's a station SOR in this example, and the dropdown says it's a class GWS. So obviously you would have to have the class GWS in your system, and you'd have to have a generic web services interface in here. But once you had it, here's two configuration examples. So this first one is a synchronous client, and what you can see here is that we have a number of stations. You can dictate the number of concurrent messages that can go out at one time. This actually is analogous to a thread. So that whatever you configure there, that configuration will take, in this example, 5 threads. You can set various timeout parameters. You can set the various endpoints. The application endpoint would be where you'd run the query. And then in this example, we have the authentication type set to OAuth, which is a very popular way of getting a token. It's a token-based service. And so typically on a token-based service, you need a second endpoint. And that's what that authorization endpoint refers to. The application source is remote, so you can see that the direction is output, and this would indicate it's a synchronous client configuration. So in this example, the web service client, when it starts up or whenever it receives a 401 unauthorized, it would send and refresh a token through the application, the authorization endpoint. And it would use those credentials that you see configured there too. So in the switch, you would just configure, you would configure a new user and set those new user credentials right here. Then it would, now in OAuth's terms, they call them client ID and a client secret, but essentially it's user ID and password, just a fancy name for them. And we would send those out to the OAuth, get a token, cache that token until it expired. And then we would inject it into the requests that go out on the application endpoint. And so those requests will be denied unless you have the token there. And what we do is very simply is embed the token in the HTTP authorization header. And this is sync client configuration, and this is working. If anyone has a use for that, talk to their project manager and consider installing the generic web services interface to get that accomplished. The very first time you install it, obviously you're not going to get a whole lot of payback if you use it one time. It's only when you reuse it over and over. We have some customers out there that literally have dozens of web services clients, and all of them are custom. And that's because, again, you have to be able to convince the remote side that this is the way we want you to publish that contract. Otherwise, you can't configure it here, because we have to know, the only thing we know here is the endpoint name. So therefore, we have to understand the contract on the other side. And that's why we've made it generic. So I'll move on to the second part of the synchronous client model, and that's, again, the synchronous server. And I'm way far away from the screen, so let me see if I can read what I put in here. But we've got, basically, this is an example of a SOAP service. If you look at the service type there, the first one was the REST service. And this is an example of a SOAP service that would be deployed to Tomcat on the message switch. And the application endpoint would represent where that's published. And you would just literally give that out to a vendor and say, okay, if you want to run queries, and this is a query-only service on the synchronous side, and there's a good reason for that. The reason you can only run queries is due to the fact that, again, things are not persistent. So typically what would happen if you allowed anything other than query, and again, this model will only handle queries. It's the async model that will handle everything. It's not that we're not covering that, but in this particular model, you can send queries in, again, a DMV sending in a stolen check. But if you let them send enters in, the issue becomes, sometimes, 99% of the time, everything's up and running and smooth, and you would get a response. But what typically happens is, NCIC might be down for a little while, or a CCH, or a remote source that they're querying, and their enter is just sitting in queue, and it's going to process fine. And then what happens is they time out because it's a web service connection. The connection goes away. So now on their end, they're sent an enter in, and they want to make sure it goes through. They didn't get an answer, so what are they going to do? They're going to send the enter again. And they have 2 enters in the system. One gets to the top of the queue, and it enters successfully. But now there's no connection for it to go back on because that original connection is gone. So you get a spill. And then the second one gets to the top of the CCHQ or whatever it's querying, and it'll get a duplicate already on file. So you end up with two support issues, one from a vendor saying, I'm getting this duplicate already in file, and another one from internal to say, why did we get a spill? And they're both related, but that gets very annoying. So you always want to do the async model when you're doing a full-blown enter, modify, cancel, the whole full message suite. But we get that a lot of people want to do simple queries. So that the simple query model is a synchronous model, and we will return a response for it, as long as it's query only. But if you try to send an enter on that, you'll get a reject back indicating that it's a query-only service. So that's the second version of that, and we're very close to finishing that up. I'll just move on to the final slide here. The async model, which will be available sometime in 2020, 2021, and that will do the full back and forward. The async model is very good in that you never want to lose the ability to play back. One of the greatest features of the message switch is the ability to play back messages, and not only just for troubleshooting, but we've had many instances where, for whatever reason, we need to resend messages to a remote source, and rather than have people re-enter them, you can just play them back in the right sequence. Very, very valuable. So let me stay on the slide and just get to the takeaway here. So the takeaway are just the dates on when they will be available. Again, early Q2 for the synchronous model. And of course, the requirements will be that you get class GWS support put into the system along with the interface. And then, of course, it's up to you, the next two bullet points, to have a talk with your remote agencies and convince them that this is the way forward. And then you finally have gained control back over your interfaces. One important thing to note, because the two documents you're going to hand out, one of them you hand out today already. It's the OFML specification. So the reason we're using OFML is because OFML is a basic messaging format. And all it does is take the NCIC MFCs, the ones that you know and love, name, DOB, sex, and it puts them into very simple XML format. And it's not proprietary at all. Some people say, well, it's called OFML. Well, yeah, because you can't have an opening tag of XML because that's a reserved word. And that's so other than having OFML as the opening tag, there's nothing proprietary at all. And everyone realizes that when they look at it, you can equate it to the NCIC MFCs and get up and running with OFML really, really quickly. But one important point is that even though you're exchanging OFML, we're not saying that you have to only exchange OFML. Obviously, Endless XML is out there, and NCIC XML is out there. They can be the payloads in an OFML message. So as long as the message switch understands, if we already have style sheets to transform back and forward between any XML message, we will allow that for use, and you can configure that for use on any message key. Okay, so how are we doing on time, Laurie?
We're doing great. So do you want to pause here, Ian, and see if anyone has any questions about?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, sounds great. So at this time, if anyone has a question, you may unmute your microphone and ask a question, or type it into the chat Q&A area.
I'm just checking the chat Q&A. And then let me just see if I can show you. Again, the OFML specification is a well-known document that hasn't changed. And then the GWS specification document, we do have a draft of that. Let me just see if I can do this. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that generic web services 1.0 draft. Laurie, can you see that?
It's loading right now, Ian. Yes, I see it now.
All right. Well, since there's no questions, I'll just flip through this real quick. It's not a completed document; it's just a draft. But it's this is the document.
Question in the Q&A by Kate Hatfield.
Okay.
So Kate would like to know the timeline, when this will be available.
Yeah, the timeline is the synchronous side of it will be available start of Q2 next year. So if you've got any repositories that you want to query, I would advise you, via web services. I'd certainly advise you to talk to the PMs and the sales about getting a statement of work to get that put into your system. Obviously, like I said, if you have just one, it doesn't make sense in the very first go around, but you'll it's very cost effective going forward. So yeah, Q2 is the very start of it. And we don't have an actual date for the asynchronous model, the full complete model, but we're anticipating that we should be able to finish that up next year. How early comes down to how busy we are. But it'll definitely be a 2021 delivery. And again, just flipping back to the document here, this is the document that you would hand out. It's a very short document at the moment. It's about 10 pages. We need to fluff it up with real world examples and some message flow. But what it does is just describe the various standards that we're using. And as you can see, I mean, it's everything everybody knows: SOAP, HTTP, XML, OFML. The WSDL and the WADL are the contracts I've been talking about. These are the very simple contracts that they need to publish on their end. They can embed an XSD. In our case, they embed an OFML XSD just to describe the message, the OFML message. SOAP, of course, we just described very simply what SOAP is. I'm not going to go into detail on that. It's a very simple SOAP envelope with a header and a body. The body would contain OFML in this case. HTTP is the actual transfer protocol. XML, we all know what that is, and there's OFML. And here's a good example of how simple OFML is to come up to speed with. The reason we need OFML is, most of those header information, that's how we route the messages. The TRAN and the RSP can be any OFML MFC, but they can also be any XML message that the message switch already understands, and that's the full suite of endless XML. So you can put in the contents of RSP here could be a NEAM boat response and an endless style registration response. When we get through with the NCIC project, it could also include those. And as we grow that base of messages that we understand, that pretty much will cover the entire suite of law enforcement messages. WSDL, we just talked about what that is. That's the contract, and we have an example. The WADL is the REST version of that. WSDL is for SOAP. WADL is a web application description language. And again, XSDs just describe the actual messages themselves. They're the schemas. And if we look down here, just very brief description of what the interface requirement will be, an example of a client. And then a sample configuration. We've shown you a couple of screenshots. This actually describes what each field represents and how to configure it. And then, of course, we're working on the OpenFox server side, and we're working on sample message flow. But we're well underway, and we're happy to get this out there. And again, it's a next year deliverable, but it's already based on the proof of concepts. It should be a doable thing. So now I'm going to.
So while Ian is switching back to his presentation, are there any additional questions?
Yeah, any questions you've got afterwards? I'm sure you'll go back and maybe talk about this with people, and then there's always questions later on. We're welcome, as soon as I get that, you're welcome to copy the draft. But again, it's probably better off waiting another, into next year to when it's fluffed out. And it's definitely not something you'd want to hand out to a vendor yet. But the synchronous client model, that should be completed very shortly. Okay, so we have another presentation also in the web services arena. It's just a basic brief update. There's probably 5 or 6 slides here, so I'm not going to bore you with too much more web services stuff. But for those interested in the NCIC, I got to slides here. Let's just move on to the FBI N3G Policy Board. This is what we know so far about the June 2019 Policy Board, what they've mandated. And so I'm pretty sure all of you guys would have gotten a copy of this. But essentially what these two bullets cover is the timeline that they would like all of the message switches to switch over from dot delimited format to NCIC NAME format. And not only that, they're also mandating that you switch off of the legacy sockets interfaces onto web services. And going forward, only new functionality will be available on the web services side of things. They're not going to update the legacy after September of 2022. So that's the backdrop, and similar in scope to what Analysts did. But they did it in two different stages. They allowed us to flip out the protocol first, and then later on flip out the messages. Now, in a way, NCIC is kind of saying here we want it all as one, but then we had some questions into them to clarify some stuff. And shout out to Rick Stallings and Arkansas for getting some of these answered for us. But we did have some recent email communication with the FBI, and so just going through some of their answers here, you can see that we were very concerned that we would have to do an all-in-one scenario, just a lot of risk in that. So they clarified that you can stay on your existing legacy socket interface and the web service, that both could run concurrently until you get to the end of the project. Then they want to decommission the legacy side. That makes total sense. So then the second question, can states migrate from dot delimited format to NAME format, one MKE at a time? That was important to us because we want to do a phased approach. The interface is just too important to switch everything over in one go and risk an outage. So they clarified that that would be possible, that they will allow us to switch over one MKE at a time. Another option was one file at a time, but MKE is more granular, and we're very happy that they answered that way. So then there was a question about unsolicited messages and how that would work. And unsolicited messages, dollar messages, will continue to be received via the current connection until the state is fully converts over. So you can leave those to last, and that's probably a good thing. Then you have to switch the unsolicited over to, you have to publish a receiver for them to be able to send that to you via callback. So will NCIC be able to provide presentation style sheets? This is a huge issue. Initially, they were not going to do that. Initially, their focus group came back and said that the whole purpose of this is to be flexible, that the remote agencies want to be able to style the XML any way they want. And I think they later realized that a lot of agencies would not have the dollars to be able to even build their own presentation style sheets in the vast amount of messages that NCIC return. That would be a huge undertaking, a lot of dollars. And so we kept on with them, and a few of the customers said the same thing, that we would like to get presentation style sheets from the FBI. They're the data expert on their own data, and they should be able to present it in a way that everyone is used to today. And maybe there'll be some modifications to that, maybe they improve or enhance things. The idea of being flexible is so that you can, get that you have best of both worlds. You have the ability to apply their presentation style sheets to turn them back to text, but you also have the ability to go through that tag data. If you're an application and not a human reading it, you can go through that and maybe pre-fill, a crash report or an incident report or citation or whatever you need to do with the information. But now that you've got fully tagged data, that's the part of flexible that people were wanting, and that's definitely there. They've done a great job on their XML. But the presentation style sheets, had we to do that ourselves, that would be a huge undertaking, and it would be a constant source of maintenance, version 2 and 3 and 4 going on. So they've agreed now to provide those style sheets by 2021, which is great. So that was the email conversation that we had. And then in the meanwhile, in the background, we've been doing a lot of work on making sure that we, CPI, can deliver that interface in the time frame allotted. Now, NCIC time frame is 2022, September 22, and I don't think it's completely on customer radar yet. So maybe those initial dates might go out from the NCIC, but right now we're looking at as that's a deliverable, and we're in the background actively seeking out how to come up with an interface. So what we've done, and we have a proof of concept for this, similar to the very first thing we did, and this is the CPI approach to N3G interface, similar to the way the initial NCIC system, the beloved 1967 dot delimited message formats, when they switched over to the NCIC 2000 format, obviously around 2000, we put a message flag on the key to distinguish it. Now, most people, I think there's only one customer that I know of that still has some old style keys. So we're going to use that same approach, either reuse that flag or create a whole different flag to indicate whether a key is configured for current processing, the NCIC 2000 style processing, or N3G. Now we could reuse the other one by just switching out the flag, but I don't know which way we'll go with that. But the point in having that flag is to allow the interface, which is the next section here, the interface to make some decisions when it's dealing with a message. So the first thing we looked at in the NCIC, the FBI responses, was they said you could run both interfaces together. So our initial thought was we'll install a new interface. We'll leave the old one, legacy one there, and we'll install a new one, and it'll be similar to the Analytics web services, and everybody has that. We know it works, and we could start from that perspective. Problem with that is your auditing doesn't work out too well. So we came up with a different approach so that everything would be audited against the NCIC station. Archive retrieval will be happy, CGIS audits will be happy. And that's a hybrid approach where we actually acquire a new class of stations, an N3G class. So those N3G class stations are web services roller stations. So they replace, they're for only handling any message keys that are flagged as needing N3G processing. So essentially the existing interface will stay. Only on startup it will now handle two classes. We'll take over the existing sync and async stations that handle the legacy sockets, and we'll also acquire the class N3G stations. Then, of course, it's easy. Once we get a message, we can take a quick look in shared memory to see if it's configured for N3G processing, and if it is, we'll route it out to the class N3G stations. Otherwise, it'll go to the legacy. And if there's any issues, you can always undo that flag and flip it back over, and it'll go back out to the NCIC sockets interface. All in all, we like this approach a lot, and we're working on this. The first customer that we've worked with for a proof of concept and communications is state of Indiana, and we thank them greatly for allowing us to do that. And what we're trying to do here is get it on your radar so that you can go out and start working with the FBI to get the communications up and running. It's actually a significant undertaking to get it running. And maybe that's because it's the first time we did it, but we've been through it once. We can help you guys out getting through it with the FBI. But there's a lot of routing and networking, and there's also a lot of added security that they've added in here. But the rest of our approach there, once we've made that MKE configuration decision on where to send the message and how to process it, that handles the communication. At the very end of all this, we will, whenever all the keys are migrated, of course, we'll set down those stations, and over a period of time, we will deactivate them completely and deprecate the communication code that handles that, so that you're only on the web services side. And again, the query style sheets, that's something that CPI will provide. We will go from dot delimited format, XML, all the custom XML formats that some of the interfaces send in, and we'll make sure that we upscale those to NCIC N3G NEAM XML format. Presentation style sheets. This is answered in the emails from the FBI. The only key concern there is that they did specify that they would provide them one time in that email. So we would encourage you guys to maybe have that conversation with the FBI and see what that really means. We'll, of course, in the background try to find out ourselves. But if that means we'll only provide them one time, it begs the question of maintenance. We, CPI, will consider those national standard. And we would discourage you from changing those. Changes would be better. I really think the FBI will probably have versions of these. They won't change very often, but you could probably lobby to have certain, visual, textual labels maybe changed, or the way things show up. And that would go through the FBI. What we want to do from a message perspective is drop those in. So if version 2 comes out, that becomes a TOU for us. We deploy those out to your switch unmodified as is, and that way you're always on the latest ones. To do it any other way would be, a maintenance nightmare. If we had 31 states modifying the presentation style sheets, you would eat up a lot of maintenance hours just trying to get to the next version. So we would discourage that. It can be done if there's a pressing need for it, but we would discourage that. And that's the CPI approach to N3G. For your takeaway, we encourage you to contact your NCIC representative. There's a list there. And they have a checklist. It's not a very detailed thing but it's how you start the process. They're just looking for a point of contact, IP addresses, network kind of stuff, and they want you to check a few boxes to say what version of the services they want, and then they'll contact you back. And there's a lot more paperwork. So contact your representative and get that started. It does take quite a long time. And now I'd like to open it up to anybody to have a comment or questions on any of the web services, including N3G.
So just as a reminder, you may unmute your microphone if you'd like to ask a question directly, or you may type it into the chat and Q&A section.
And there are no questions. I think I can probably show you how simple that checklist is. And let's see. At some point, that checklist should load.
So while that's loading, Clay was asking if he could receive a copy of the presentation. Yes, Clay, these will be available for you to download at some point. So CPI will be sending out that information following the TIM.
Yeah, just don't expect to get it signed, though. It won't be worth anything anyway. I don't think you can sell this on eBay with my signature.
And all of the recordings will be published as well. So for those, I know a few people had audio issues at the beginning. So the recordings will be published and you'll be able to hear Ian's presentation in its entirety.
Can you see the NCIC checklist or no?
Yes, I can, Ian.
Oh, you can. Okay. Very good. So that checklist, as you can see there, I'll just scroll up here a little bit, maybe blow it up. People can see it. All they're really looking for is a point of contact, say which agency you are, give them a phone number and email, and then which IP addresses you're going to be sourcing from, port numbers. We can help you out with this, actually. I can look up what we filled in for the Indiana proof of concept. Asynchronous notifications for web services application. So that's at the end where they're talking about dollar messages coming in. And of course, you'll have to provide them a URL, so they need to know those type of things. And that's pretty much it. Now, like I said, that just starts the process, and then they'll send you a bunch of paperwork to get the real details. So, with that being said, unless there are more questions, I think we can take a break. I know there's two more presentations, two more birds of a feather, Laurie, if you want to mention those.
Yes, that's correct, Ian. So first of all, I want to thank everyone for joining the conference. As Ian said, or enjoying the presentation. If you have any follow-up questions, please contact your CPI project manager or sales representative. The next and final session of the TIM will be starting at 3:15 Central Time. There are two options for you to choose from, one on software updates, TOUs, and support. And the second will be on SOR 2.0, which will be a deeper dive and continuation of the morning session. So on behalf of CPI, I'd like to thank you all for attending the TIM. We look forward to seeing you hopefully in person next year. And if you have any questions, Ian and I will stay on the line here a few more minutes. Otherwise, enjoy the last session. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.